Hey Adam, you have some nice plants in the background.
Yeah, I'll thank my in-laws for the. I got the there's an elephant in the background. It's a symbol of bipartisan unity. That's what I'm
Oh,
going for
oh,
here. That's what I'm
okay.
going for. Yeah.
So that's great. Even before we start, we're already sort of getting into the politics of the moment, which is perfect.
Yeah.
I think I have the
Yeah.
two people I need for this. In the middle of COVID-19, the domestic politics references behind you, Adham. It's perfect, perfect introduction to what we're going to talk about. First and
Absolutely.
foremost, thank you both for joining. I know these are very strange times. We have our preferred location for pretending like we're at an office. This has become an office setup for me. I also want to thank you for reaching out at him because this is a topic that I'm interested in, and I'm glad that I saw both your names included. So Shadi, thank you for joining into this conversation. We can start off with the article because I think it kind of speaks to the moment. Something that was, I think, before COVID-19, this was a maybe a more covered story, and it almost seems like the whole domestic politics thing has taken a way back seat, way to the back. So let's bring it back to the front. I got the feeling from this piece how foreign policy factors for American Muslims in 2020, as a sort of, this is an instinctual reaction I got, is that two things matter. First, and maybe for the first time in recent memory, the Muslim American vote is a critical vote. And that's something I haven't sort of read this or seen this articulated the way you guys did. So that's important. The second thing is that the Arab-Israeli conflict can now be debated thoroughly. And this is something also new. Let's start with the first one. The Muslim American bloc, if you will. Is this something that you sort of, and I'll start with you, Adham. Did you sense this as sort of being a foreign policy advisor to Peter Buttigieg? I will not say Butros Abu Jej. Screw it, I'll say it. Butros Abu Jej. Did you sense that there was a sort of a growing curiosity in the Muslim American experience, at least when it comes to a Democratic nominee? Or is this something that goes before that? That this is sort of an experience that you've witnessed regardless of the last and current election?
Certainly. And those are great places to start. I think I'll start with some of what drove me into politics in the first place and policy at large. I grew up in the southwest suburbs of Chicago, a suburb called Bridgeview, densely populated by Arab Americans, around one of the most prominent mosques in the country in the Midwest. And it was in that sort of post 9/11 wake where a lot of members in the community started to sort of wake up and get civically engaged at the local, municipal, and state level, and eventually into national politics. When Shadi and I published this piece, we got a lot of interesting feedback, and everyone wants to chime in very thoughtfully with what they thought about the 80s or what they thought about the 90s, and I'll say that I wasn't really around for that, so maybe we'll have Shadi handle some of that. Not to age you, Shadi, but I'll say that in my experience, the response to the Bush-Cheney years, the invasion of Iraq, the securitization of the U.S. government's relationship with the American Muslim community and the Muslim world at large, these largely national security sort of topics drove the Muslim community to mobilize for Barack Obama in 2007, 2008. And, it wasn't surprising that folks, organized these get out the vote campaigns and voted for him, en masse. But before that, I remember, as a kid, sitting in the cafeteria during the Gore-Bush election, folks were coming and saying, my classmates were saying, my dad said vote for Bush because, Al Gore is not going to be good on Israel-Palestine. And I didn't know anything about that at the time. I think I was in, second grade, first grade.
Oh,
But I remember
now I feel old.
yeah, my apologies. But this was, I sort of saw that evolution from the post 9/11 era onwards. I would say that the Arab Spring sort of derailed a lot of that energy and momentum that was, catapulting American Muslims into the national scene and into democratic politics. A lot of these institutions, and this was stuff that Shadi and I alluded to, a lot of these prominent American Muslim institutions, MPAC, CARE, MAS, ISNA, are largely driven by and led by or founded by immigrants of Arab, Middle Eastern, South Asian descent.
Yeah.
And I want to preface all of this, and we tried to do this in the article as much as we can without having too many caveats, that the American Muslim community is not one block. It is enormous. It is very diverse. You have African American Muslims who have been in this country since before the nation's founding. You have Latino Muslims who are the largest growing demographic of the Muslim community by conversion. So in no way do we want to erase other segments of the community from that narrative. But, when the Arab Spring happened, folks like people in the Syrian American community, where I come from, began to look back to the motherland. My Egyptian American friends and folks who were concerned with what was happening in Egypt began to look to what's happening there. My Libyan American friends began to look at what's happening back home, the hopes and aspirations of their family members and friends back home. We were, well connected to that, given that we were, first or second generation, not right. Quite that removed from the politics abroad. Then Trump comes in and sort of, I think, shakes folks back into, realizing that we can't afford to keep our foot off the pedal. We can't afford to have this sort of atrophy in our national organizations. And through various vessels, whether it was the Women's March or the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016, and other activities organizing against the Muslim ban, for instance, you start to see this, the American Muslim community being a keystone species. I wouldn't say a very important electoral bloc, but I would say a keystone species within progressive democratic organizing. And I'll just stop there.
No, and before Shadi, I just wanted to say that that's a very nice sort of introduction to the bottom-up experience, that this is sort of the American Muslim engagement in local politics. And I hope I got this right. The Muslim American population is 1% of the total population. So it's a small affair. It's very small, but it's also something else that's happening, which is maybe the top-down approach, which is that there's a political curiosity. And I got the feeling that there was outreach maybe in my experience, the first time, a sincere outreach from the nominees, from the candidates, curious about Muslim American voices. And Shadi, could you maybe sort of talk about that sort of this unusual, whether it's Sanders speaking openly about Palestinian rights, whether it's even Elizabeth Warren sort of championing protests in Lebanon and Iraq, that kind of curiosity?
Yeah, well, so first of all, as you said, we're about 1% of the American population, but we're, I'd say, influential beyond our numbers, and that's a somewhat recent thing. Mm. And Barack Obama, whatever else you think about him, and he kept his distance from the Muslim community. He kept us at arm's length, and understandably so, because he was perceived as Muslim by a surprisingly large number of Republican voters, but also, a lot of us Muslims joke that he was the first Muslim president and all that stuff.
Yeah.
We don't want to emphasize that too much because people might get the wrong idea. I don't actually think Obama was Muslim. It's just like but he is like sort of part of the family in some sense,
Yeah.
So, in a sort of counterintuitive way, Donald Trump's election was obviously very worrying and frightening for a lot of us. And I remember trying to process what his victory meant the day after, the weeks after, and even in the lead up to the election. I think there were some worst case scenarios where we're like, how bad could this actually get? Yeah. And there was almost, I remember that I had the talk with my parents. There was sort of a Muslim version of the talk where it's like, hey, if it gets really bad, what are our backup options here? And my dad is also a Canadian citizen. So half jokingly, but also I think half seriously, we had a conversation where he was like, "Hey, just so you're aware," and sometimes I forget that my dad still has his Canadian citizenship, but it's like, there is a path to citizenship if you, I don't know exactly how it works, but God forbid, there is a sort of a backup option here. So there was that side of Trump's election, but in a way, Trump also propelled us into the cultural mainstream in a brand new way. That because Trump was so obsessed with us, and this is starting with the campaign, with the proposed Muslim ban and all of that, he made us a centerpiece of the national conversation. And because of that, I remember in 2015, everyone was talking about us. We had become an object of other people's conversations. And when Trump actually became president, what that meant for the Democratic Party was one way to signal your anti-Trump credentials was to be very pro-Muslim. And it was a way to kind of be like, oh, Trump, look, he has this obsession with Muslims. He doesn't like Muslims. So we're going to be the opposite of whatever he's doing.
Right.
And I like that. It's good because the Democratic Party really came out defending Muslims and opposing the Muslim ban and the various iterations of the Muslim ban, there were like 3 or 4 or whatever. So there was a moment in 2017 where a lot of this stuff was coming to a head. And I think that there were also more Muslim voices that were willing to speak out on behalf of their Muslim identity, people who weren't very visibly Muslim before. Aziz Ansari is an interesting case who became more vocal about Islamophobia, even though before 2017, Aziz Ansari was very open about saying that he didn't consider himself theologically Muslim. He wasn't religious. He wasn't a believer. But Trump sort of, he made even people who weren't very Muslim, in quotation marks, feel a need to speak up. Because we seemed a Muslim, we were visibly Muslim. So I think those dynamics are really interesting to look at. And then we see later on the rise of very visibly Muslim politicians like Ilhan and Rashida Tlaib and so on. And that's interesting because even though I think there's a debate in the Muslim community about how much we like or don't like, we shouldn't presume that all Muslims like Ilhan and Rashida. That said, we are all sort of on a first name basis with them. Even when we talk about them amongst ourselves, hey, what do you think about Ilhan? Or hey, did you see what Rashida said the other day?
Yeah.
And as it turns out, it just shows you also what a small world this is. A good friend, Rashida, is actually roommates with one of my good friends here in DC. Okay, but I don't know. If we're supposed to be public about that.
Okay, so I'll edit that part out. We'll just say beep. Yeah, that's funny.
But I remember, so it's just interesting that it's we're all 2 degrees from anyway. Yeah. So, but to get to your bigger question about, then there's also the mainstreaming of the mainstreaming of the predominant Muslim position on Israel-Palestine. Again, we have to be careful about overgeneralizing. There isn't a Muslim position on Israel-Palestine, but I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of American Muslims are at least to one degree or another pro-Palestinian, in the sense that they don't like the idea of Palestinians being killed or repressed by Israeli occupation forces. That's a fair, I think, generalization to make. There are major differences, though, on one state versus 2 state, and things like that. But most American Muslims think that the U.S. government is too unquestioningly pro-Israeli. And I think that if you look at the Democratic Party, there has been a major shift. And one thing that we really emphasize in our piece is that there has been a sea change in how the Democratic Party talks about Israel, Palestine, and I think we as American Muslims have become part of that. I mean, that we're no longer an outlier. We're not the ones who sort of have to we don't have to kind of
you don't have to explain yourselves per se. It's sort of like it's out in the open in a sense. That now it's easy to engage this topic as opposed to just a few years ago. You almost seemed like you're on the fringe when you'd bring up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No longer on the fringe, and we're in the mainstream of the party because the party has changed and has become more willing to speak out on behalf of Palestinian rights to various degrees. But you saw that, I think, certainly, even the fact that Bernie Sanders, the fact that he would say things that would be quite controversial 5 years ago or 10 years ago, talking about conditionality with U.S. military aid to Israel. That used to be a third rail of the American public conversation. No one used to talk about that. But he would bring up these issues, and they weren't even that controversial.
Right.
And people were like, oh, that's Bernie. And the fact that you could speak out about those things without it ruining your career, without it making it impossible for you to be the front runner, and let's recall that Bernie for like 2 weeks was the front runner, that tells us something about the shifting discourse within the Democratic Party. And we can talk about this more, but how Israel-Palestine isn't just about Israel-Palestine.
Right.
It's a proxy for a deeper set of ethical commitments on progressive foreign policy.
I want to take it a step back, and I like that there's a Pew Research poll you included, which is the I'll say this carefully, Muslim American attitude towards the LGBTQ community, or at least homosexuality in general. And I think 2007, it was something like 20-some percent, 27%, if I'm not mistaken. And only just a few years later, 10 years later, it's gone up. It's in the 50s, 52%, which is astounding. So that in itself is and that has nothing to do with Arab-Israel conflict. That's got nothing to do with Middle East affairs. That's a very domestic evolution. And I want to just sort of gauge you on this. This is a new alliance, so to speak, on the left, center left, that you have sort of that kind of discourse, and it also includes a fairly socially conservative segment of American society for the large part. And I think, Adham, you may have alluded to that earlier, that you grew up with a father who kind of was sort of, he thought Bush would be a better candidate than Gore. And I'm guessing not just because of the Israeli-Palestinian stuff. It could have been also for other things too. And I have my own relatives in the States that have leaned Republican without me really understanding why. And over time, I sort of see it as more social conservative attitudes than anything else. And then you have on the left the Bernie Sanders crowd and that segment too. And sort of it's an unusual moment where they're kind of lining up. And then that community, the LGBTQ community, becomes very pro-Palestinian too. They're the ones kind of speaking up very, very favorably to Palestinian rights. So, and that's just 10 years. What is it about those 10 years? Is it a reaction to the Iraq War? Is it the post-9/11 environment? And is it disillusionment with Obama? And what is it that decade kind of spells dramatic change?
Shadi, if I may, I think one thing that I like to emphasize is that it's not necessarily. I don't think there's a clean split between domestic and foreign. I think a lot of American Muslims' views on various public policy issues also reflect the evolution and this growing sophistication of American Muslims' views on their own sense of citizenry and their belonging in the world, and their agency as Americans, and their understanding of the difference between, civil laws and religious laws. I mean, these are things that Shadi can speak to at much more depth. And so for someone in my parents' generation to say, hey, I like this Pete guy, and I don't care that he's gay. I think he's right on the issues.
Right.
That reflects not only an understanding that I don't want to call it necessarily as progressive liberalism or acceptance or tolerance or any of these, sort of condescending concepts that, you have to tolerate or you have to accept or whatever. It's more so this sense of like, we live in this very diverse, pluralistic society, and voting on issues and on policy preference is different than what your preference is for, who you go home with or, where you pray. And that reflects, I think, a sophistication within the community that's growing, and I think it's intergenerational. I don't think it's just limited to young Muslims. Mm-hmm. Something that you alluded to was, that we're in the trenches together. American Muslims, the Latina community, the African American community, the various causes, whether it's Black Lives Matter, the Women's March, the opposing the Muslim ban, you name it. When these folks are all working together in coalitions, it breaks down a lot of barriers, and it forces people to be able to see eye to eye on issues that matter, and also on issues that maybe were secondary or tertiary. So I think that there's that evolution is there as well. I did want to revisit some. I don't know how this format works, but I did want to revisit a previous topic, if I may.
Of course.
On the Arab-Israeli conflict issue. I second everything that Shadi said, and I'd also add that it's become a lot more easy for folks who work on Middle East policy to engage in Washington in the policy space within the Democratic Party than it is to engage on the issue within the Arab American and American Muslim community. There is far more nuance now in Washington on the issue, and far more political space to be able to take a variety of positions there than it is within sort of the grassroots space, where sometimes it's a winner take all, my way or the highway sort of mentality. One of the things that I think the piece that we wrote tries to emphasize is that, what Shadi called the sea change in the Democratic Party's views, not just on Israel-Palestine, but on some of these moral and ethical issues and questions within the Middle East, whether it's on restraint in the Middle East at large when it comes to military action, or how the U.S. deals with its, at times problematic allies, whether it's Israel, Turkey, or the Arab Gulf states. Because of that, right now, I would say that folks who are trying to line up behind the Democratic nominee are having a tough time, an uphill climb, convincing folks for whom Israel-Palestine is their number one priority, mm-hmm. that we need to be able to see the bigger picture, and to do so in a way that isn't condescending, that is not in any way dismissive of Palestinian rights and the indignity that Palestinians suffer daily, or the atrocities that are carried out by the Israeli government, and to do so in a way that says, look, if we want to build on the gains made within the Democratic Party on Israel-Palestine, on Middle East policy at large, we need to vote for the Democratic nominee, make sure Joe Biden is the president. The problem is, in addition to Israel-Palestine representing all of the important things that it represents, it is one of the three holy sites. It houses one of the three holy sites. And I think the decades-long history of the conflict, the optics, the trauma borne by the community, the fact that a lot of us in the American Muslim community know a Palestinian American. We know what it's like to hear the stories of the Nakba, and we've had their great cooking, and we know their songs and so on. It's endeared that conflict to the sense that it's become the privileged conflict. So you have civil wars currently burning in the Middle East, in Yemen, in Libya, and in Syria, arguably with far more grave geopolitical considerations and consequences for not just the Middle East, but also to Europe and the U.S., that hardly get any mention within the American Muslim space relative to some of the, what I would call the privileged conflict.
Bernie Sanders made it a sort of, he focused in on it several times, and he made it maybe he brought it back to a degree. I think it kind of faded to a point, and it's sort of, now it's been mobilized again, that the Palestinian rights matter. And it's just a curious sort of moment, though, that Bernie Sanders, and I remember this. He sort of identifies himself as a Zionist. He's comfortable saying it, but he's also a pro-Palestinian American politician. And I find that very, 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 very unusual that can sort of, you can, a Muslim American can turn to Bernie Sanders and say, that's my guy. And within that coalition, you have this fairly new understanding that Palestinian rights matter. And really, I just want to go back to that sort of the center left, that those years, 2007 until 2017. What happened that made it kind of so favorable so that the Democratic Party, in particular Bernie Sanders, but others too, could sort of be comfortable saying we stand up for Palestinian rights?
Well, so I think one part of it is that there's been a growing realization that to be a progressive, you kind of have to be a progressive in all things and not just in domestic policy, but not foreign policy. If you're progressive to various degrees on all the various domestic policy issues, but then you're like, hey, let's support dictators or let's have an endless war on terror that undermines the stability of the Middle East and undermines human rights and so on. I mean, it just doesn't work. There's something incongruous about that. And if you're a self-described progressive, then what that means is that the ethical framework is important. And the whole point of ethical frameworks is that they can't be compartmentalized. Right. Otherwise, it really wouldn't be an ethical framework. It would be something else and something rather inconsistent. Yeah. So I think that with the rise of progressive movements, with the rise of this kind of grassroots sentiment that we haven't been taking human rights seriously enough domestically, as it relates to minorities and structural racism and so on, that if you want to extend those premises, you have to also be willing to talk about the structural factors that lead American foreign policy to be quite dismissive of human rights concerns. Long-standing, decades-long support for authoritarian regimes is a big part of that, and that's something both Adham and I are very outspoken about. So I think that Bernie speaks to that, and I think that, but also to various degrees, I think Elizabeth Warren and Mayor Pete also, I think, connect those two wings of the progressive world, the domestic side with the foreign policy side, and you try to build a broader narrative about how you talk about the role of values and morality. And to be a progressive means that moral concerns matter, not just for Americans, but also for those who are not Americans and find themselves on the receiving end of America's pretty bad policies in the Middle East. So I think that's been a shift that we've seen over time. And it's something, there's something beautiful, maybe beautiful is an overstatement, but there's something nice and something pretty cool about the fact that many American Muslims were rallying behind someone who could have been the first Jewish president in American history.
Yeah. I think it's.
I do want to add.
Sorry, go ahead, Adam. Yes.
No, it's all.
I was gonna say it's magical. I think this doesn't happen. I mean, even in America, this is a very special moment, and it's hard to imagine this happening anywhere else. Sorry, go ahead, Adham.
I also want to, emphasize that, to give credit where credit is due, the Palestinian American and the Palestinian Solidarity movement, which is not, which is diverse, and they've done an incredible job over the last, span of decades, inserting the Palestinian cause alongside or in parallel to other causes for social justice. So whether it's indigenous rights here in the United States or elsewhere, trying to draw parallels between the treatment of Native Americans and, indigenous Palestinian communities back in their motherland, to the treatment of African Americans by police, to how Palestinians are treated by the IDF. So that incredible work, I think, has borne fruits. Linda Sarsour, who is, a prominent Palestinian American activist and a surrogate for Bernie Sanders, she herself talks about how, Bernie Sanders' views on Israel-Palestine and his advocacy for Palestinian rights and his engagement, his I guess, very out-front engagement with the American Muslim community, which is admirable, didn't come overnight. That was a product of engagement and, disagreement and years of work within that progressive space in the Sanders camp. So that credit to them and their agency and their work for making that happen. As much as I admire, Senator Sanders for his advocacy on Israel-Palestine and engagement with the American
prelude.
Muslim community.
I love that. This is almost like I should copy paste that for my own purposes later. I love the beginning of the. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. Carefully spoken.
I saw Shadi smiling, so I knew he knew I was going to pivot here.
Yeah,
but
it was pretty obvious.
I will say that among the reasons why I supported Mayor Pete, among the many reasons why I supported Mayor Pete, or I would say among the many reasons why I didn't support Sanders or why he wasn't my, top candidate. I'm not going to reveal who my top 3 candidates were, but he wasn't my number 1 candidate, was sort of because he embodied some of the tendencies within the progressive left, this reflexive anti-imperialism, anti-Americanism that exists, that blames a lot of the problems in the world on America, and thus tables over, and at times, in some of its worst manifestations, whitewashes the crimes of brutal regimes, whether it's, Tulsi Gabbard's engagement with the Egyptian dictator Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, or visiting Bashar al-Assad after the destruction of Aleppo in 2016, whether it's seeing a lot of these, folks in the Russian disinformation orbit who prominently backed Sanders, who spend a lot of their time whitewashing the crimes of the Venezuelan regime, of the Chinese government in Xinjiang, of the Assad regime, of Putin, that they have found comfort in that space. And this is something that I and other progressives and other Democrats have called on Sanders to take a bit more of a harder line on, which is, there's no progressive moral universe where Tulsi Gabbard should have had a home under the Sanders umbrella. Not in my imagination. And I'm hoping that whether it's the Buttigieg campaign learning from its mistakes, or the Sanders or Warren campaigns learning from their mistakes, that the progressive left also learns from the mistake of alienating Latin American voters for, Sanders doubling down on, the Castro regime had a good public health program here and there, and also being a vessel for some very problematic voices when it comes to foreign policy and morality.
But just a final point on that, speculation, if you just remove the Palestinian issue, and if Bernie Sanders never addressed it, do you think that kind of, that there would be a leaning towards the center left among the Muslim American voters? Or does it really just come back to that is still a major issue, and that foreign policy matters, and that is one of the biggest issues when it comes to the Middle East?
I mentioned earlier that I think it's the privileged cause, given its history, given what it represents in terms of some of the United States' worst instincts in the Middle East. So I think that it's always going to be important, but at the same time, what we don't want to see is progressives to be, what some folks call progressive only on Palestine, an acronym that I'm not going to spell out. There's also the pitfall.
Took me a second.
But there's also the progressives except for Palestine, or progressive except on Palestine. So we see both sides of the coin. What I would advocate for, and what I'm sure Shadi would advocate for, is consistency in some sense.
Right. But I mean, sorry, go ahead, Shadi. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I find I'm sort of in an odd position, since I don't really fit into any of the obvious categories, I was and still in some way am a Bernie supporter. He was my preferred candidate, but I'm also known as being pretty hawkish. Some might say very hawkish on some aspects of foreign policy. And that's why, sometimes people were confused about why I supported Bernie. And sometimes I even struggle to explain it myself because it's not obvious. But a couple things I would say. I mean, one is there was an aspect of Bernie's foreign policy vision that I don't think got as much attention that really appealed to me, and this was the anti-authoritarian narrative. Now, some people say that it wasn't as consistent as it could have been, and I would have much preferred that Bernie did not praise any aspect of the Castro regime. But when we're talking about being critical of what I consider to be the most problematic allies in the Middle East, I think Bernie was the best on really calling out Saudi Arabia, very good on calling out the Sisi regime, being an outspoken opponent from rather early on the Yemen war. Yeah. So on things like, and there was really an effort to outline a coherent view on that went well beyond Israel-Palestine. And so when I was looking at candidates and trying to decide who I felt closest to on some of the issues I cared about the most, that's what appealed to me about the Sanders campaign. Now, are there folks on, let's say, the hard left who supported Bernie who I think have terrible views on, say, the Assad regime? Yes, and I think it's unfortunate that you had those people, as part of the periphery, let's say. And I think we also have to draw distinctions between the sometimes bad supporters of Bernie Sanders and what Bernie Sanders himself actually said and did on his campaign. Do I wish that Bernie was a little bit more hawkish on intervention in Syria? Yes, but, I'm never going to have my perfect candidate. So I had to, Bernie was not where I was on Syria, because it's actually pretty difficult to be more hawkish than I am when it comes to military intervention against the Assad regime, although maybe Adham might compete with me for relative levels of hawkishness. I don't know. So, but I think that a sign of maturity as a community is that we're never going to have the perfect candidate. And it means deciding that, hey, and this is the same thing with Biden. I think that both myself and Adham, we have concerns about Biden. He wasn't our first choice. He wasn't my second or third choice. But you know what? Biden is who the Democratic Party voters decided to go for. We have to respect the will of the primary voters, and let's make the best out of a not ideal situation and hope that we can push Biden to get better on the issues that we care about.
Let's take that one step further. I think you referenced the bipartisan foreign policy consensus. And that's, if I'm understanding that right, that could be Bush, Clinton, it could be Obama and Biden. It's just that there's a consistency that's not healthy, and that maybe for the first time in American politics, there's sort of a different take on that. And do you think Biden do you think any of what we discussed about Bernie or the center left kind of bringing up issues that were not in the mainstream, do you think Biden will actually be able to take some of that? Will any of this translate to the Biden camp, or is it still sort of that is the consensus camp, despite all that's happened?
I think Biden can't help but be influenced by the shifting positions within the Democratic Party. The fact that there is a strong progressive left wing of the party that has a different view on foreign policy. If he wants to unify Democrats, which I think he needs to do as much of that as he can if he wants to beat Donald Trump, you got to bring Bernie Sanders supporters in, Warren supporters in, and so on. that he has to be more responsive to this part of the Democratic Party that wants to see a different kind of discourse when it comes to things like the legacy of the Iraq War, or the fact that the war on terror didn't, the endless wars on terror aren't the best way to approach foreign policy, or that you shouldn't be so indulgent of Netanyahu, and you got to say, hey, not only is Netanyahu the problem, but there's a broader problem that the mainstream of Israel has unfortunately moved in this center-right direction. So you can't just get away with saying Bibi's the problem and leave it at that, and that's almost like a cop-out, because then you're not speaking to the broader structural problems that even someone like Benny Gantz doesn't have good positions when it comes to Palestinians and so on and so forth. And he has to be able to speak to that, and if he doesn't, American Muslims, progressive activists have to call out Biden, but in a kind of constructive way. It shouldn't be an adversarial way where we say Biden is bad. Why did we end up with this terrible candidate? I think at some point we're going to have a more constructive kind of two-way communication where it's like we are part of, as American Muslims or as progressives, depending on which identity, if you will, we want to emphasize, that we have to say, hey, we want to be a part of this discussion, and here's what we think, and here's what we have to say about Israel, Palestine. Listen to us. We're not going to expect you to have the perfect progressive position on Israel, Palestine, because that's not who Biden is. That's not his history. But if he can become better than what he has been in the past, that to me is the constructive engagement that I have in mind.
And Adham, could you add to that, as somebody who was a foreign policy advisor to Mayor Pete, do you sense that there's a trend in the Biden camp to sort of take in from that and maybe listen more on that front?
I wholeheartedly believe that, Biden as a person and as a politician, reflects some of the very best of, what we're looking for in American politics in terms of empathy, in terms of, wanting to listen and wanting to bring in a diversity of voices to the table. I think he recognizes, as Shadi mentioned, that you have this powerful, young, energetic Democratic base that, on the one hand, wasn't able to deliver not even a county in Michigan for Bernie Sanders, but still is very important and will be the future of the Democratic Party. And we're already seeing Biden adopt and adapt various policy proposals from the Warren and Bernie camps, whether it's on student loans or whether it's on policy towards banks. There's a lot out there on how I think sort of the olive branches that the Biden camp has been extending to the Bernie and Warren camps, and that's very encouraging. On foreign policy, I'd also have to add that, there is this conversation about morality and, ethics being inserted more aggressively into our foreign policy. But I think that the driving force of bringing forward some of these preferred policy preferences of progressives and American Muslims on foreign policy will come from what is described as a more realist camp that has already started to assert itself in the Obama years, in the Obama administration. The shift away from prioritizing the Middle East, I know, the Arab Spring and its aftermath sort of, and the rise of ISIS forced the Obama administration to, be more deeply involved in the Middle East. But already you saw this so-called pivot towards Asia and China, where the Middle East was far less prioritized. And you're also seeing other, shifts in the world, be it from the coronavirus, which is going to bring forth drastic changes in the region in terms of regional upheaval. Today I'm not even going to pretend to be an energy and oil expert or at all well versed enough to carry a conversation on the issue, but the price of oil plummeting, the economic catastrophe that's going to arise because of the coronavirus crisis, what that's going to do to the region, and how that's going to affect regional order, the resolution of the civil wars, the outstanding civil wars in the region, in Yemen, in Libya, and Syria. That's a lot of that's going to accelerate the United States' departure from the region, and it's going to accelerate China's insertion into the region. So a lot of those shifts that began in the Obama years are going to continue, and it's going to make it a lot easier for the next administration to sort of pivot towards a foreign policy that progressives can be happier with.
Sorry, Shadi. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so.
And by the way, I just want to add before you begin, Shadi, I love the dreamlike atmosphere behind you. You have that setting where it blurs the walls, but it keeps you crystal clear. So it's kind of like you're, almost mythical, like.
That's very kind of you to say. No one's really said quite that before, I guess. But I do have this special wallpaper, so I think it has an interesting visual effect.
Whatever it is, it looks dreamlike behind you.
Great, excellent. Okay, so, and this is, this is speaking for myself. So, and I should say that I don't represent Adham's views on everything. So I don't want. Okay, anyway. I don't think that Biden, if he wins, and God willing, I hope he will win, because I just can't, as just like in terms of like my own personal sanity and just wanting to have a more relaxed 4 years to the extent that we can, I really hope Biden wins. That said, I am under no illusions that Biden is going to have a great foreign policy, especially on the Middle East, because a lot of the old folks who were there under Obama, and I'm someone who was extremely critical of Obama's Middle East policy, which I thought was an utter disaster. And I worry that some of what made Obama so bad on the Middle East, Biden shares some of those instincts. And you know what? We're just going to probably have to live with some of that badness for 4 years or however long, and live to fight another day, and to realize that if we really want U.S. policy in the Middle East to change, that's going to be a long-term struggle, and we're going to have to think about how we can try to affect those changes over time, gradually. But, Biden does not have a great history when it comes to autocratic regimes. Mm-hmm. This seems like forever ago, and I guess it kind of was, but a little bit before the Arab Spring started, both Biden and Obama refused to call Mubarak a dictator. Yeah. They were, kind of hemming and hawing about that and being very careful and talking about Mubarak. All of them did that. Even Secretary Clinton, just I think it was a couple weeks before Mubarak fell, said something like, "It is our assessment that the Mubarak regime is stable." Mm-hmm. They were really engaging in this very problematic stability discourse, I would call it. And so Biden is a product of this very cautious, careful, here are our allies in the Arab world, and we don't want to push them too much. We can sort of put modest pressure on them, and we want them to be better and to respect human rights more, but they're still our allies, and we need their help on Iran, we need their help on Israel, Palestine, so we have to balance these different priorities. Biden is very much of that school, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. That said, going back to what we were saying earlier, we do see signs that Biden is trying to adapt at least a little bit some of his rhetoric. He said, and we mentioned this in the piece, where he did talk about Saudi Arabia under MBS being a pariah state because of the killing of Khashoggi. So there are things like that, and that's where I think there can be some positive adaptation. But when we're talking of Biden, who he is, his history, and someone who's been engaging on foreign policy issues for decades, from before even I was born, he is who he is.
Let's wrap it up with a subject that kind of ties into this, which is what's been happening in the Middle East prior to COVID-19, the unrest, whether it was in Lebanon or Iraq, or for that matter, to a degree in Iran, these sort of the uprisings that we all witnessed on the news, and this demand for accountability, in particular in Lebanon, and sort of the push in Iraq, where the violence on the streets, but the demands continuing, and what's been happening in Iran, that kind of blackout, and if that is to continue post COVID-19, if the demands persist, if people go back to the street, just in your own experience in dealing with policymakers in the States, what do you think protesters need to do in order to at least steer American policy in the right direction? Because I'm getting kind of a bit of pessimism from you, Shadi, that Biden, and I actually subscribe to a point to what you're saying, that he does sort of echo you said it, the bipartisan sort of consensus that we're used to. And Adham, I actually agree with you that, and I agree with both of you that it would be refreshing to see 4 years of calm, not this kind of hysteria that we've witnessed under Trump. But if it's the protesters that are going to effect change in that part of the world, is there something that they should be doing to at least encourage America to behave in a more sort of, at least on the right side of history, where it's not defending the autocrats, whether it's Hosni Mubarak, or for that matter, tolerating the likes of Assad, or being very reluctant to get involved today with all that's happened post-Iraq war and the Arab Spring, all that in 2020? Is it up to the protesters to actually encourage America to behave differently?
So I'll just say quickly, I'd be curious what Adham has to say on this, but I think that there's only so much they can do, in the sense that their major priorities are their own regimes. I mean, that's, and they have to build strong coalitions. They have to be aware of domestic context, and we're also in a world now where the U.S. doesn't seem as important as it was, say, 10 years ago. So one concern I would have is that protesters and pro-democracy activists have lost so much faith in America's role that it simply doesn't matter to them as much anymore. But it will matter to some extent. And this is, and if they're thinking about how they can adapt their message accordingly, I think one way to kind of get Democrats more on board is to draw on the partisan contrast. We are a very polarized society, and what all Democrats agree on is not being like Trump. So if they want to make their case, they can be like, hey, Trump was supporting our authoritarian regimes. Now we're really hoping that you good Democrats, because you're not like Trump and you want to draw a strong contrast right out of the gate, that you can draw that strong contrast by saying that Trump brought us too close to authoritarian regimes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that if Democrats have to show that that's not American policy.
And in that sense, Democrats would have to break with the Obama years as well and say that that may not have been the right path.
Yes, and that's my hope, that Trump in some sense has made democracy promotion a bit more partisan.
Uh-huh.
And that, if Trump does something, our tendency as Democrats is to try to do whatever the opposite is. Sometimes that's not good because it leads us to be very reflexively anti-Trump. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it's good because you can say, well, hey, Trump was very close to MBS and Sisi. Let's do the opposite of that.
Interesting. What about you, Adham? Do you echo that sentiment?
Well, certainly, the next administration, if we have one, will need to break with the current administration in terms of its naked embrace of authoritarianism, the sort of transactionalism in our foreign policy, expressed in a way that, in that America First sentiment. That's something that, the cynics of the world, including, some on the progressive left, will say, well, that's what it's always been. It's just that Trump is saying it, more clearly, more baldly. and I would agree with Shadi, as well as his sentiments and views on the Obama era Middle East policies. That there's not much to love and be nostalgic from that time. The next administration, and hopefully this next generation of national security professionals, folks who have seen what reflexive, this sort of pendulum swing from interventionism to isolationism, how both can be disastrous. Finding a middle ground where the United States is both engaged but also prioritizing, the salient drivers of. Oh wow! I really need to not start these sort of verbal trains that sort of leave the station before I've even decided what I'm even going to say. Let me restart that.
Well, I was a comfortable passenger on that train, though. I was following you the whole way.
Well, yeah. Let me. Where can I pick up?
But I mean, I just wanted to go back to the protesters, though. So, would you both agree that that's limited in terms of at least steering American policy, that they are sort of focused there? They can't really encourage America to behave differently, that the onus is on American policymakers, and that's really where it has to be.
So yeah, let me take this one. I think what's going to be important, if we have, a Biden administration next January, in the context of the COVID-19 response, and which will exacerbate the drivers of instability in the Middle East, as well as the causes for why protesters were in the streets of Lebanon, Iraq, and elsewhere, that as the economies of these countries continue to deteriorate, that the United States is present not only to be part of the recovery, but is also there for political support, lending support for the Arab streets, and really being able to prove that it's going to be there in support of democracy and human rights in the region. And that doesn't necessarily have to come in the form of military intervention, but it certainly won't come when you see the sort of signaling and messaging that's coming from many in the democratic foreign policy space, which is, the United States must sort of pivot away from the Middle East, or the United States has no major strategic interest in the Middle East, or there's no more terrorism, therefore the United States has no reason to be in the Middle East, or the United States is energy independent, therefore the U.S. no longer needs to be in the Middle East. That all signals all of the wrong messages for, protesters in the streets, but also to these dictators who can now count on getting a green light, whether it's to deploy chemical weapons or whether it's to shoot tear gas at protesters in the street.
I know it's a very broad subject, and I know that this is sort of like, this would probably take a whole series of discussions, and I know we touched on many different things, but it's great to hear a perspective from the States on what's happening, not just to America, but that part of the world. And most of the time I'm focused on Lebanon and regional affairs only, so it's kind of nice to see that there's an active, sometimes a certain degree of disagreement, but also an active discussion here in the States about what's happening here and there. And I think it's a very strange time that we're doing this way. I know that every episode I used to do was in person, and it was very intimate, and now I'm sort of relying on Skype and virtual intimacy, if you will. But I appreciate you guys doing this during the middle of this pandemic. And Adham, you're in Arizona, is that correct?
Currently in Arizona.
And Shadi, you're in New York? Or D.C.?
Oh, Adham, you were in Arizona?
Yeah, I came to visit my in-laws a month ago, and then when the NBA shut down and Tom Hanks got the disease, we all decided to stay put here.
Oh, okay. That was a turning point, Tom Hanks. Yeah. No, in some ways that did sort of shift the national attention in a serious way. I'm in D.C.
You're in D.C.
I'm in D.C. Yeah.
So it's kind of like the neighborhood now. Adham, you're somewhere in Syria. Shadi, you're in Egypt, and I'm somewhere in Beirut, and we're kind of talking about the same issues. So I appreciate it, and thanks for your time.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.